experts' opinions during the testimony, or sometimes the court's like a heads up so that we don't have a big sidebar in front of the jury. So how would this court, what is this court's preference?
I suppose I don't mind a heads up, but
You may not be able to do anything about it, but I got the sense from the defense yesterday, and of course, I don't know exactly what they're going to do with Dr. Arnell, but that they want to show him body worn camera potentially. His report is very unclear about whether or not he reviewed it. And we're not on notice of it if he did. And he doesn't talk about particular videos in his report.
okay.
He also refers to Dr. Sina's report quite a bit. And based on the Golub case, GOLOB 180 P3rd 1006, I don't believe it's a basis for his opinion. It's the people's position that he's bolstering Dr. Sina's opinion. And just in addition to the body worn camera, it's not even listed on his report. He makes a reference to video images once in his report. So those are the two things that the people are concerned with and wanted to bring to the court's attention.
All right. Anything else?
Yes, sir.
To the record just made by the people, we're essentially asking for the same leave to elicit expert testimony, similar to the fashion in which the prosecution did. None of the expert reports that we received included a sort of video synopsis or discussion of where in videos observations were made and what opinions were going to be elicited relative to video evidence. So the prosecution experts were shown the admitted exhibits and then asked to offer opinion evidence relative to what is seen in the video. Dr. Arnall's report contains his opinions, and it does reference review of video. It is true that he doesn't say all the videos that he reviewed. I don't think any of the experts enumerated them specifically, or in terms of where on the videos they would be asked to
Well, I'm quite sure that Dr. Buther and Dr. Mitchell testified that they spent numerous hours reviewing all of the video over and over and over again.
They testified to that, and we would ask that we be able to ask Dr. Arnall the same, that he also reviewed video evidence and how long that review entailed. That's, I think, part and parcel of the expert opinions on both sides of the case. I intend to play for him a few videos that have been admitted and simply ask him similar questions that were posed.
Well, if he's reviewed them before, then that's fine. You ask him that.
I think that addresses the objection. Oh, there was a second component of Dr. Sina's opinion. I guess I don't understand the objection because it is not improper to ask an expert whether they have reviewed the opinions of others and whether they agree with them or disagree with them. So we're not going to bolster the opinion, but his report does provide notice that he has reviewed that opinion and that his opinion is similar. Prosecution experts, I think Dr. Mitchell was asked how his opinion compared with Dr. Mitchell's, and there has been ongoing reference to experts reviewing the opinions of others and then their take on them. And so I don't understand the objection to that, but we would be asking to do that consistent with the report we have provided.
Would you like to respond?
Okay.
Is in Dr. Buther and Dr. Mitchell's reports, they specifically list how the body worn cameras that they reviewed. And in their grand jury testimony, Dr. Buther mentions video or body worn video 28 times. And Dr. Mitchell refers to it 6 or 7 times, and specifically what they were looking at as far as Mr. McClain breathing, his coughing, his statements, I can't breathe, what he looked like before ketamine, what he looked like after ketamine, when he's unresponsive, when he deteriorates. All those things are clearly delineated in their grand jury testimony, and the defense was on notice. The fact that we did it perhaps in a little different way in the courtroom does not make them not on notice. We just showed clips with the doctors in the courtroom, but all those that subject matter is clearly talked about in the grand jury, and they were on notice of that. Unfortunately, Dr. Ornell's report does not do that at all. He doesn't list what he reviewed. He doesn't list the hours that he reviewed. He doesn't make an opinion about the body worn camera and what it shows. So it is the people's position that we are not on notice if the defense was on notice regarding showing videos to the experts. And it's a very different situation. Regarding Dr. Sina, the case law is very clear that you have to use the expert's opinion as part of your opinion. You just can't use it to bolster the other experts.
Well, the Golub case really is a little bit different in that there was a CBI agent that testified, and it's the normal procedure, I suppose. When it comes to fingerprints, they call it ACE-V, but it's always reviewed by another fingerprint expert, or here is a shoe print expert. And the agent who testified about that somebody else checked it and said it was good. Here, both of the witnesses are testifying, so I don't see it as, I see them as quite distinguishable. The court would further note that early on in the case, the court did allow, if the experts wish to do so, to be present or watch on video what's going on. So I don't know exactly what Dr. Arnold is going to say with respect to Dr. Sina's report, other than he agrees with it or disagrees with it, but I don't really find that to be bolstering here when both witnesses testify. Anything else?
I just have a housekeeping matter. I discussed yesterday about just submitting things for the appellate record. I don't know how the court wants me to label it. I have one that was that's the protocol and directive when Deputy Chief Stephen Redfern was testifying. I'd attempt to bring in 9.4 of the APD directives, which is the mutual agreement between the police and the firefighters, or excuse me, Aurora Police Department, Aurora Fire Department. Does the court want me to, and I know that was.
Yeah, what I would do is just, I think we're to D now. Mark it as D, and the record will reflect that D was not admitted.
Okay, would we say, do you want D or do you want like AA in case we submit additional one actually for the record later?
Oh, I just use D.
Okay.
I think as long as it's on the record, then the appellate court can figure it out.
Perfect. So I have D, and then I also have, based on our discussion yesterday, Ms. Tereshenko's supplemental report. I can label that E, and it occurs to me that I should probably also submit her original report as well, just for purposes of the record. I don't have a copy of that. If the court doesn't mind, I could follow up with the original copy. Or
Well,
excuse me.
I guess what I was thinking, maybe I was not thinking clearly, but all of those reports and such and the transcripts were sent to me via email. It would make some sense if we uploaded those.
Sure. So the one that I have is I did my best to strike through the testimony that the court disallowed. So it's her supplemental report with strike throughs that you could still read the original content. And so I'm happy to upload the originals as well. Would the court like me to label this as E?
Which one are you talking about?
Oh, sorry. This is the supplemental report of Miss Dr. Tereshenko.
Yeah, just however you want to label them, DEF, whatever.
Certainly.
And you're welcome to upload those as well.
Thank you, Judge. And Judge, I'm not looking to relitigate the issue, but I just do think that there's some additional information that needs to be put in the record regarding Exhibit E. And then I'll also have Dr. Tereshenko's original report listed. I know that Mr. Slothauer had mentioned that it was not his intention. It had never been their intention to call Dr. Tereshenko in this matter. However, I would note that they endorsed her as an expert witness in this matter after the severance. Additionally, I think there is some, and I think Mr. Slothauer mentioned this, but I just wanted to make the record clear. I believe there's a little bit of confusion in Exhibit E, which is the October 25th report. My understanding is their office asked her to write this report. We did not ask her to write this report. And so I think there's a little bit of confusion as to, my understanding is that they hired Dr. Tereshenko and they were asked her to write a supplemental report, I believe, for the paramedic case. And I think that's how it's read here, that she is responding to the experts in the paramedic case. And they were unhappy with some of the opinions that she made. Now they then asserted that it's because we gave her discovery, which is accurate. We gave her additional discovery. Now, I believe Mr. Slothauer had made the record that it was not his intention to have her comment on Dr. Buther's report. However, I would note, and this is where I think her original report is relevant for purposes of the record, but they did give her Dr. Buther's report.
The original one.
They gave her the original one. They just chose not to give her the supplemental. They also gave her, and I think there are some issues regarding the body camera footage. They also gave her, and I just realized that given the ongoing litigation here, the record may not be clear for our case, but they also, for her original report, gave her multiple different body cam reports, as well as a master sync sequence, which for purposes of this record, I understand they're not calling that expert in this case, but that master sync sequence is a compilation of body cameras that they had hired an expert to stitch together to show a continuous, continuous sequence from beginning to end of the encounter with Mr. McClain. And so, understanding, again, not looking to relitigate, I just believe it's important to put that in the record that they had provided her all these things. They had requested this second report, and somehow they just don't like the opinion she's giving. So again, understanding the court's initial ruling, I've made my record. I just wanted to submit these, and if I could have leave, I'll submit the original report later on as well.
All right. Anything else we need to address?
Sorry, just for the appellate record, I need to clear up some of that as well. To be clear, the people haven't provided Dr. Tereshenko with any new medical causation evidence like Dr. Buther's supplemental report. That went out in May this year to the defense, and they provided it to Dr. Tereshenko. We only provided her the defense expert reports from the Cooper and Jacuniak case. We asked her to write a supplement on just those issues, And instead, she showed up and started talking about this aspiration and Dr. Buther issues. I'm not sure if she was prompted to put that into the report by the defense, or if they just had solicited that opinion before from her and she wanted to throw it in on her own. But that was not an opinion that we solicited on that topic. Dr. Terashenko is obviously free to opine in whatever way she wants on in terms of the substance of her opinion and what she thinks actually happened, and to have her opinions. But in terms of the subject matter of those, we did not request that, and that was put in there for reasons that we don't understand and don't know why.
There's 10,900 reasons. All right. Okay.
I'm sorry, Judge. I forgot the last part of that. Yes. And so, Your Honor, regarding D and E and the record that we made, I believe at this point, we have been understanding that we are just about to begin to present our defense. I believe that based on the record that we've been making this morning, we have been precluded from effective cross-examination as well as presenting a defense to Mr. Woodyard as exhibited by the prohibited protocols, as well as the reduced testimony of an expert that the prosecutors had hired for this case. Now, again, we've hired her as well, to be clear. But at this point in time, we believe that Mr. Woodyard's ability to present a defense has been severely impaired to a constitutional degree. And so at this point in time, we'd be moving for a mistrial pursuant to his state and federal constitutional rights.
All right. And the people?
And Judge, to the extent that first, the court was correct in ruling that the additional documents they wanted to bring out with Deputy Chief Redfern were beyond the scope of direct. They certainly now, in the presentation of their case, can bring whatever witnesses they want to talk about whatever directives would be admissible in this case. And the Dr. Terashenko restrictions on her testimony, I think, are absolutely correct. And in fact, the court would have been well within its bounds to order a much more severe sanction given the pattern of repeated discovery disclosures related to experts by this team. They disclosed their experts late. They disclosed their expert reports 3 weeks late. They didn't disclose Dr. Terashenko's additional topics of testimony at all, and we had to find them by accident last week talking to her about a different case. And so I think it would be appropriate to deny the request for a mistrial as there has been no error on those issues they raised.
All right. The court will note that I wasn't exactly sure on what the argument was with respect to limiting the cross-examination, but in any event, if it indeed dealt with the witness, Mr. Redfern, the court did allow leave for him to come back and testify. None of the defense witnesses have testified at this time. The court will decline to make a finding that there's a manifest necessity to declare a mistrial at this time. Anything else?
Just to seek clarification regarding the protocols, the court is allowing us to recall Deputy Chief Redfern. I've been under the impression that the reason why the mutual agreement between APD and Aurora Fire was because it's cumulative, not because it was outside the scope.
All right. I think that might have been one of the reasons the court articulated at the bench.
Thank you.
But it was also beyond the scope. All right. We have, I was just told we have one juror that's, I don't know, 5 minutes ago, she was 10 minutes out. So might be a couple minutes before we get them up here. Please be seated. Court will formally recall 21 CR 2794. The parties and counsel are present. The people have rested their case. Does counsel for Mr. Woodyard wish to present any testimony or evidence?
Yes, please, Your Honor. We would first call Dr. Michael Arnall.
All right. My right, your left, and we'll very good. You solemnly swear or affirm the testimony that you're about to give will be the truth and nothing but the truth.
Yes.
All right, please be seated. Once you're comfortably seated, if you'll tell us your name and spell your last name.
Michael Frank Arnall, Arnall.
Your witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Arnall, good morning.
Good morning.
Can you please start by telling us what you do for a living?
I am a forensic pathologist.
And tell us what that means.
Means I've been to medical school, same type of medical school as every other physician. But then I did an internship and residency in a specialties called anatomic pathology and clinical pathology. After that, I did a subspecialty fellowship in forensic pathology. Anatomic pathology is the study of the tissues of the body. We look at biopsies and organs of the body under the microscope and with the naked eye. Clinical pathology is where we do all of the measurements on every fluid of the body, mostly the blood, but every fluid of the body. And then forensic pathology is that subspecialty where we use all the principles of medicine and the principles we learned in anatomic and clinical pathology to answer medical legal questions.
Where are you currently employed as a pathologist?
I do autopsies for southwestern Colorado in Cortez, Durango. I do autopsies for Silverton and Dolores and Pagosa Springs.
When you say you do autopsies in that area of the state, is that the nature of your practice, or what all does your practice entail?
As a forensic pathologist, the local coroners are charged with determining cause and manner of death on people that pass away. If they need an autopsy, they call a forensic pathologist, and I do the autopsy for the coroner so that they can determine cause and manner of death. In addition, I do consultations for defense attorneys like yourself, and then on the autopsies, I testify at the request of the prosecuting attorneys if a case needs to go to litigation.
And just generally speaking, how do you determine cause and manner of death? Are you familiar with those principles?
I am. Manner of death, I have 5 choices: homicide, suicide, accident, natural, and undetermined. And I use the principles in the textbooks to decide which of those determinations is most appropriate. Cause of death can be anything that you would find in any textbook of medicine, any disease process, any injury, any type of drug or substance. And then, of course, I use those principles that we've learned in medical school and in my residency and fellowship to determine what the most appropriate cause of death is.
And how long have you been employed as a pathologist in the southern Colorado area you discussed?
Well, I started doing autopsies down there for the previous forensic pathologist when she would want to go to a medical meeting or vacation, and that would have been 2005 or 2006. But then I've been doing regular work down there, I believe, since 2016 or so.
And Dr. Arnall, prior to this current role, did you work as a forensic pathologist previously?
Yes.
And where was that?
Well, starting back I did my fellowship in 86 to 87 there at the Denver County Coroner's Office in forensic pathology. Then I did a year in Boston And I did a fellowship in surgical pathology down in Houston. Then I went to Florida and did both hospital pathology as well as forensic pathology in Florida. Then I came back to Colorado in 2005 and started doing full-time forensic pathology again here in Colorado in 2005.
And did you work in Adams County as a pathologist once upon a time?
Yes,
How long did you work in Adams County?
2005 to about 2010, I think, and then 2011 or 12 to 2016.
Any other areas in the state of Colorado or elsewhere where you have worked as a forensic pathologist?
Well, the pathologists have cross coverage when they have to go someplace. So I helped cross cover for all of northern Colorado. I also did autopsies when coroners in Wyoming would bring their cases down to northern Colorado. And I also was doing autopsies in Boulder County.
And in all of these roles, Dr. Arnall, were you working on criminal cases as part of your work?
Yes,
Do you still work on criminal cases as part of your work?
yes.
Why, tell us about why you left Adams County.
I had a strong disagreement with management on employee relations.
Was your departure from Adams County in any way related to your work as a pathologist or your credentials or anything like that?
No,
Have you ever had any affiliation with law enforcement in terms of being employed by a law enforcement agency?
no,
Have you ever had any affiliations with the Aurora Police Department in terms of employment?
no.
In total, then, how long have you been practicing forensic pathology?
Well, I would have done my first forensic autopsies on rotation in 1985. I started my fellowship in 86, but I guess since 85, that'd be 15 and 23. I guess 38 years.
During your experience in forensic pathology, have you ever been asked to review the work or findings of another pathologist?
Yes.
How are you able to do that? How does that work?
I'm contacted by either a prosecuting attorney or a defense attorney, and they asked me to look at glass slides with a little tissue biopsy if necessary. I look at photographs. I look at videotapes if those are available. I look at medical records if those are pertinent to the case. And I look at the autopsy report, of course, of the first pathologist to see what the first pathologist saw. And then I look at any other types of reports, police reports, interviews, any type of transcripts which may exist, so as to get an idea of what has happened in that case.
And Dr. Arnall, just going back, because I want to be very clear, when you were saying that you left Adams County over a strong disagreement, were you actually terminated from your role in Adams County?
Yes,
Okay, and was that over complaints that you had over how employees were being treated?
yes,
And then to be clear, did you resume continuing to work as a forensic pathologist in this other area of the state?
yes,
I mean, do you remain credentialed and employed by the county in criminal cases?
yeah, I have license to practice, and I did autopsies as recently as last week in La Plata County and for Montezuma County and Cortez, yes.
When you were discussing earlier that you have, you will review cases both for prosecuting attorneys and for defense attorneys, does your role change depending on who you're working for?
No, I review the case in the light of the currently published medical literature, medical and forensic literature. And because I'm asked by both sides to review cases, I stick quite close to the textbooks, regardless of what the case is. The medical literature is unchanging. So whatever the medical literature says, that's what I disclose to either set of pathologists, and maybe it's good news and maybe it's bad news. That's not my problem. My only issue is to bring to them what the currently published medical literature says about their case.
I want to ask you a little bit about we've talked about your experience. I want to ask a little bit about your education. You said that you have a medical degree. Where did you go to medical school?
At the Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis, Missouri.
I think you described doing a residency after medical school. Can you tell us what that is?
After medical school, I came out here to Denver, Colorado, and did 4 years of specialty training after I received my MD at the University of Colorado Health Sciences Center when I was down there on 8th in Colorado before they moved up to East Colfax. And that 4 years is rotating 2 of the years dedicated to the tissue part, the anatomic pathology, 2 of those years rotating through Veterans Hospital, Denver General Hospital, running the laboratory, the blood bank for 6 weeks, clinical chemistry, microbiology, running the different areas of the hospital and learning how to do that, learning how to be a laboratory director.
And so how is the study of or being a forensic pathologist different from a clinical practice or someone who treats live patients?
Well, as a forensic pathologist, sometimes I'm asked to testify on non-lethal injuries because a substantial part of our training is on injuries. What do they look like? How do they happen? What problems do they cause? So I actually testify in cases where no one has died. And then on the cases where someone has died, I use all of those principles, really starting back in college when I took basic chemistry and organic chemistry and physical chemistry and biochemistry. Going all the way up through medical school and through my training, I use all of those principles to figure out why people died. People can die of any type of disease or infection or any type of injury. So you have to use all that to determine just how did this person pass away?
And Dr. Arnall, in addition to the residency, did you complete any fellowships or other kinds of specialized training in forensic pathology?
I did a forensic pathology training at the Denver County Coroner's Office when the Coroner's Office was in the basement of Denver General. And I also did a surgical pathology fellowship in Houston, Texas at the Baylor College of Medicine.
What is a fellowship?
A fellowship is that very specialized training that one goes through after they've completed their internship and residency. So after you finish your residency in pathology, you've been a physician for 4 years, and then you do another year of very specialized training in forensic pathology. That training is to anticipate the questions that are going to be asked by the court, in court, anticipate those questions, and then be able to answer those questions through your examination.
And Dr. Arnall, do you have any board certifications?
I do.
You may have discussed those earlier, but can you tell us what board certifications you have?
I'm board certified in anatomic pathology, board certified in clinical pathology, and board certified in forensic pathology.
How many autopsies have you performed?
Over 5,000.
And I assume I know the answer to this question, but have you ever testified as an expert witness in court cases?
Yes,
How many times?
over 500 times.
And how many of those, if you can even give an estimate, were in criminal cases?
The vast majority of my cases that I testify in are criminal. On occasion, there may be civil litigation related to an autopsy that I've done where one party sues another, but the vast majority are all criminal cases.
And of those cases, Dr. Arnall, the vast majority, are you testifying as a prosecution witness or a defense witness or both, either?
Well, because I do autopsies, the major portion of my testimony is at the request of the prosecuting attorney. That's probably 90% because I'm testifying on the autopsies I've done. And maybe 10% is related to cases where I'm asked to consult on an autopsy that someone else has done and end up testifying at the request of the defense attorney.
Your Honor, at this time, the defense would move to tender Dr. Arnall as an expert witness in the field of forensic pathology to include determinations related to cause and manner of death.
Objection of Woodyard.
Good morning.
I wanted to ask you some specific questions about your review of records in this case to make your opinions. It's unclear from your report what all you looked at. Did you look at the body worn camera in this case?
To look at the body itself?
The body worn camera videos? Did you look at that in this case?
Yes.
And can you tell me when you did that?
It would have been after they were supplied by the attorneys, and it probably took some 12 days to actually go through second by second. And there are multiple different cameras. So I actually went through second by second and actually created my own timeline and correlated each of those body cams. The body cams have different timelines, as you likely know. So I correlated each of those timelines and equated them so that you would know the time frame on each body cam as it related to a specific event or utterance.
Thank you. And I had asked you when you did that.
Over the course of the last multiple weeks.
Well, your report dates August 14th of 2023. And in that report, you don't list the body worn cameras and the officers' cameras that you watched them. So what I'm trying to find out from you is when you watched these.
And Your Honor, I'm going to just object on this being outside the scope of voir dire for an expertise, more akin to cross-examination.
It could be, Judge, but I'm trying to determine if he has enough background in order to make an opinion.
All right, I'll allow a bit more Woodyard in that area.
So
I don't,
I'm sorry,
please
Dr. Noel.
continue.
Let's just focus on your report. You didn't list which officer's body worn cameras you watched. Why is that?
No specific reason for not delineating each camera.
Except that it puts everyone on notice on what you did, doesn't it?
Well, you're right. There's a degree of specificity that I either chose or didn't choose. I didn't specify which specific cams that I've looked at. I looked at multiples of them. And some of the videos actually include a composite of multiples of the camera that are spliced together.
And then going back to when you did this, did you do this before you wrote your report or after?
You know, I don't recall specifically when exactly I looked at any of the specific videos. I don't recall the dates.
Well, that's all right. I don't need dates. But did you watch the videos before you made your opinions in your report?
I think so. I don't recall specifically. You know, I've been looking at this body of material for weeks. I don't recall
So
specifically when, excuse me, I don't recall specifically when I looked at each piece of evidence, and many of the pieces of evidence I've looked at repeatedly over many weeks.
But my question, Dr. Ornell, was, did you watch the videos before you rendered your opinions in this 9-page report?
And I'm telling you that I don't recall specifically.
Well, wouldn't you have needed to watch the body worn cameras and review the reports in order to make your opinions?
We're getting into cross-examination now, so.
Judge, at this point, the people are objecting because we don't think that Dr. Ornell has the foundation to make opinions in this case.
All right, response on behalf of Mr. Woodyard.
Your Honor, Dr. Arnall has more expertise, frankly, in forensic pathology in terms of years of practice, tantamount, I think, beyond what we have seen from any other experts. He's well qualified to offer opinions. He has listed in his report a litany of materials that he has reviewed. He's saying that he did not specify the dates that he reviewed certain body-worn camera, but his opinions are not limited to body-worn camera evidence.
All right, the court will, over the objection of the people, allow Dr. Arnold to testify and explain in the areas of anatomic, clinical, and forensic pathology and offer opinions in those areas.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Arnall, how did you become involved in this case?
You contacted me and asked me to look at the case materials.
Okay. And did those case materials include items other than body camera footage?
Yes,
Okay. Are you compensated for your work when you're asked to look at a case?
yes,
Okay. Do you charge an hourly rate?
yes,
And what is your hourly rate in this case?
$150 an hour.
Do you have a set hourly rate or does it vary?
It varies.
How much time would you say that you have spent looking over the various materials provided to you in this case?
You know, after 150 hours, I stopped keeping track.
I want to talk about the materials that you were able to review. Were there medical records provided to you?
Yes,
Did you review them?
yes,
Were you provided copies of autopsy reports?
yes.
What can you learn from an autopsy report, or why did you review those in this case?
There are 2 autopsy reports. Forensic pathologists have a method that we're all trained. We all have to pass the same board examination, so that in looking at an autopsy report, I can reasonably anticipate what another one of my board certified colleagues has done, because we're trained, not at the same institution, but we have to pass the same boards. So I look at the observations of the forensic pathologist to understand what they saw with the naked eye, what they saw under the microscope, and they take samples of fluids of the body, and I look at their autopsy report to understand what those fluids of the body revealed.
And in this case, well, let me ask you, do you know Dr. Steven Sina?
Yes,
How do you know him?
when I worked for cross coverage in Northern Colorado, I actually cross covered when Dr. Sina needed a weekend off, so I'd work weekends up there in Northern Colorado.
And does the,
Also, I've been asked to review his work on previous occasions and testify as to my review of his autopsy reports on previous occasions.
and how, if at all, does your knowledge of Dr. Sina affect your review of his work? Just goes to any motive or bias in terms of his relationship in the review.
Overrule.
Unrelated. I have no particular bias one way or another. His report is his report.
In your experience, do pathologists sometimes arrive at different conclusions, having reviewed the same evidence?
Yes,
Based upon your review of the autopsy report, do you have an opinion about whether the autopsy examination was complete?
I have an opinion.
Okay, and what is that?
Yes, it was the same examination, naked eye, microscopic, toxicology. It was the same examination that I would do. It was complete.
As part of your review in the case, did you also review interviews that were conducted with physicians who treated Mr. McClain at the hospital?
Yes,
Were you provided with a toxicology report related to this case?
yes,
And were you aware, or did you review that there were various actions of first responders involved in this case?
yes.
As part of your review, you had said earlier that you constructed a timeline of events. Can you explain why you did that?
To understand what happened, there was a timeline, which was a good beginning. But to understand some of the events, a much more specific or tighter timeline had to be generated. And I actually went through second by second, looking at the different videotapes, stopping it when an event occurred, writing that event down, so that I would know the time frame of each of the events on the video tape. And some of those time frames are, particularly relevant to questions which have arisen in this case.
And when you were reviewing the timeline, what evidence or materials did you rely on to do that?
Well, my timeline goes through both the events that occurred outside the hospital as well as the events that occurred inside the hospital. So that on my timeline, there are the events that are seen on the videotape. I also had the benefit of another timeline that had been generated previously. And then I used all of the medical records and the records of the first responders to generate that portion of the timeline that extended beyond the events that occurred outside the hospital, and so as to include the events that occurred on the inside of the hospital as well.
Dr. Arnall, are you able to tell us, in terms of your review, how much you relied on medical records versus video evidence, if possible?
There are a variety of opinions that I have. The physiologic opinions, the opinions related to medicine, are substantially related to the medical reports of the first responder. But there are also opinions related to aspects of the physiology of the medicine prior to admission to the hospital, prior to the paramedics beginning to create medical records that are related to the video tapes.
Well, and let me just ask you, you were asked when you reviewed video, did you review video evidence in the case?
Extensively.
Okay. Do you recall when my office reached out to you to retain your review in the case?
I don't remember the specific date. I could look it up on my emails, but I don't remember the specific date.
Well, when you were saying earlier that you've been looking at this stuff over the last several weeks, did my office reach out to you sometime last spring?
Yes.
Did your review begin just over the last several weeks?
No, I began to assimilate information as you disseminated it to me.
And after you wrote a report, did you continue your review as you were preparing to potentially testify in the case?
Yes.
From a medical perspective, Dr. Arnall, why were you interested in the timeline pre-hospital?
In general or specifically?
Both.
Well, one of the issues that's going to come up is a carotid hold. And looking at the timeline and listening to the events on the audio portion, I attempted to create a reasonable assessment of how long that event may have occurred from start to finish. So that was one of the reasons that I wanted to go second by second, if possible, to understand, to infer from what people were saying, because I couldn't see it on the video, infer from the audio how long that event may have occurred. For forensic reasons, that's important. In addition, there are the main issue for which you consulted me, and that is the relationship of the person for whom I'm consulting, Mr. Woodyard, and how his activities are related to any of the subsequent medical or physiological events which occurred. So it's important to see where Mr. Woodyard is, what he is doing at each moment.
And so when we asked you to review the case, were you asked to focus on the actions of one police officer?
Yes,
And so when you are saying that essentially the Woodyard team asked you for this review, were you asked to review with any specificity actions of other police officers?
no,
Did you review as part of your assessment of the case, did you consult with scientific articles or medical literature?
yes, extensively.
Can you give us a sense in terms of trying to understand what happened, why the review took this long?
There are multiple issues in this case, medical issues. And the proportion of medical events related to Mr. Woodyard is quite minimal. It's a carotid hold. But the medical issues as to why the decedent actually passed away are extensive. And I elaborated or illuminated each of those issues. And then I wanted to present to your team scientific articles that would indicate the ramifications of any opinions that any expert might have on those events. So a lot of the time was spent generating scientific articles so that you would understand several very complex medical issues.
And as part of that process, Dr. Arnall, did you in fact review some of the statements or opinions of other experts and physicians in the case?
Yes, of course I did.
Did you review or consider evidence in the case of vomiting?
Yes,
Did you review or consider questions in the case related to aspiration?
yes,
Did you review or consider questions in the case related to acidosis?
yes,
And finally, did you review or consider questions related to the issue of hypoxia or hypoxemia?
yes.
In your opinion, are those medical issues evident to the naked eye in a body camera? Can they be diagnosed?
No,
in terms of trying to figure out what, if any of those were occurring inside of Elijah McClain's body, is there any way to measure or diagnose that in this case from the materials that you've been provided to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Before he goes to the hospital, no.
Are there possibilities of those things occurring?
Yes, of course.
In a criminal case, in your experience as a pathologist, would you normally review body camera footage?
I have before, yes,
Can that be appropriate?
of course.
And in your opinion, was the body camera evidence important in this case?
Yes,
Why is that?
in general or specifically.
Both.
There's a struggle in this case. The time period of that struggle is important when comparing it to the published scientific literature. And that time period can be ascertained by looking at the video. And the time period of that struggle relates to the likelihood of hypoxia, low oxygen, acidosis, high acid in the body. You ask about the vomiting and aspiration. That can plainly be seen on parts of the video. Where the individual is not, where Elijah McClain is not seen in the video, it can be heard from time to time. One can hear vomiting in the audio portion. As to whether vomiting caused aspiration, anyone who aspirates coughs, and you can't control that. It's a reflex. It's not voluntary.
Response.
I can reframe the question, Your Honor.
All right. The court will strike the last part of the testimony having to do with coughing. Go ahead.
In the video, did you review, or let me ask you it this way, was your review focused on the initial part of the duration of the video?
Objection, same objection.
Well, this is,
The court will overrule the objection.
this, Dr. Arnall, is just to orient you to a portion of what you reviewed in the video. Did you focus on the initial part of what we're going to call the duration here?
My focus is on the initial part because at some certain point, the individual is asked to review, Officer Woodyard, figuratively and literally.
Sustain.
Did my office ask you to review the application of a carotid hold in this case?
Yes,
And what, in your opinion, when did that occur relative to the entire duration?
the beginning.
Okay, so I want to talk to you about that. Let's talk first about a carotid control hold. Are you familiar with what that is?
Yes,
Are you familiar with that from medical textbooks, or how do you know what that is?
well, every forensic textbook has a section on both pressure to the neck in general, every type of pressure that can occur to the neck, and carotid holds specifically. In addition, over the course of the last 38 years, I can't tell you how many cases I've done in which people died as a result of pressure to the neck.
All right. The court will overrule the objection. The witness is just trying to explain some differences.
The carotid hold requires pressure to the neck, obviously. There are structures in the neck that can't be compressed. So that the experience looking at hundreds of cases of pressure to the neck allows one to understand what occurs when pressure is applied to the neck. In this case, that pressure is with a forearm and a biceps applied on the left and right sides of the neck. So I've read it in the book. I've actually watched videotapes of an individual who confessed and demonstrated what he did, formed a carotid hold. Have read innumerable accounts of both individuals who survived pressure to the neck and accounts by other individuals regarding individuals who did not survive pressure to the neck. So yeah, I understand about pressure to the neck in general, and I understand about carotid hold specifically, and it comes from both textbook learning and specific cases that I've either autopsied or watched video confessions. In one case, I've actually seen a videotape of someone who hanged themselves and took their own videotape.
So suffice it to say, do you have experience in your work dealing with these kinds of injuries?
Yes.
How do you investigate pressure applied to the neck during an autopsy when you are trying to determine cause of death?
There may be signs on the outside of the neck, and I look for those specifically. And those types of injuries are delineated in the textbooks. Then I lift up the skin, dissect it, and I look at the muscles on the inside of the neck, around the voice box, the larynx. I look for bruises. The voice box itself is made of cartilage, and there are two horns coming up. Those are frequently broken in manual strangulation. I look at the hyoid bone, which is a horseshoe-shaped bone that's right above the voice box. I look for fractures there. Then I go ahead and take out the voice box, and I open it, and I look for bruises on the vocal cords, which are inside the voice box. I also look at the esophagus, the food swallowing tube, which is behind the voice box. Sometimes it's bruised because pressure is pushed on the voice box, and those two horns cause bruises on the esophagus. In addition, I look at the eyes. The conjunctiva, the whites of the eyes, may have small burst blood vessels from pressure to the neck. So I look for those. Those are called petechiae.
Did you see evidence of petechiae noted in this case?
Yes,
How serious is petechiae?
petechiae are nonspecific. They can be caused by a coughing fit. They can be caused by vomiting. They can be caused by CPR. And they can also be caused by pressure to the neck. They can also be caused by pressure to the chest in other types of cases. They're nonspecific, but I look for them in every case that I do.
In this case, did you review the autopsy report specific to the dissection of the neck?
Yes,
And what can you opine or conclude about it?
well, there are no injuries, but in particular, as it pertains to a carotid hold, carotid hold compresses the blood vessels. On occasion, the arm slips around and pressure may occur on the voice box or the trachea itself. In this case, Dr. Sina specifically looked at the muscles in the front and also saw no injuries, indicating he saw no evidence of any pressure to the neck, but in particular, no pressure that a carotid hold had rotated to a bar hold in the voice box. He saw no evidence of that.
And so are there any injuries that you can link to a carotid hold in this case that you observed anywhere in the medical record?
Well, it's possible that the petechiae may have been caused by either the vomiting or pressure to the neck or CPR, if that's what you mean by linkage.
With respect to the carotid hold in this case, have you been able to make an opinion about whether it caused death?
I have been able to make an opinion.
What is that opinion?
No,
Why not?
a carotid hold is a common hold in judo, the martial art judo. The records for judo go back into the 1880s, 140 years ago. In that 140 years of an uncountable number of carotid holds, there has never been a death, ever.
Dr. Arnall, can a carotid hold lead to death?
Depends on how long it's held. There's actually scientific literature on that. If it's held for 3 to 5 minutes, it can cause death. There are other experiments done in the 40s. They couldn't be repeated now, but they compressed the neck in a controlled circumstance with a blood pressure cuff and completely cut off the blood supply to the brain for up to 100 seconds in volunteers. No one died. No one had any sequela, no permanent injury from up to 100 seconds. At 100 seconds, the doctor said, forget it, no longer. But the literature says up to 100 seconds, a healthy young person, no deaths, no permanent injuries.
And so in this case, did you consider the time frame of when the carotid hold occurred?
That is precisely why I did that close time frame, so I would know second by second how long was it even possible that this carotid hold was causing blood flow to the brain to be stopped. That's why it was so important to go second by second.
And how did that affect your opinion, the time frame?
Well, I cannot, having looked at the entire frame second by second, I am well aware that the person, Elijah McClain, may have gone unconscious. Although I can't prove to you that Elijah McClain ever lost consciousness in its entirety. In addition, I certainly could not prove to you that unconsciousness had occurred for over 100 seconds. Quite to the contrary, based on review, it would appear as though if unconsciousness even occurred, it would appear as though it may have lasted for some short number of seconds.
Why are you unable to determine whether unconsciousness occurred?
There is specific verbal statements on the audio portion. And I attempted to infer from those audio statements, was a person unconscious? And in the time frame where Elijah McClain may have been unconscious, there are still audio statements which suggest that the officers were talking to Elijah McClain. I don't know whether they were talking and didn't know whether he was unconscious or talking because in that situation they knew he was not unconscious. So I'm not going to be able to tell you, I'm not going to be able to prove to you that there's any specific time period that he was with certainty unconscious. I can't prove that to you.
Dr. Arnall, when you were saying earlier that the carotid hold, the pressure to the neck cuts off oxygen to the brain, how does that affect the brain?
Oxygen is carried in red blood cells. Red blood cells are in blood. If the blood flow is stopped, then the red blood cells stop circulating and the cells absorb the oxygen that's there. But since it does not continue to circulate, that oxygen supply is not refreshed.
Has that phenomenon been studied medically in terms of measuring oxygen levels overall in the body?
In one of the studies, they put an oxygen measuring device on the earlobe. And that's supplied by the facial artery, which comes from the carotid. So that should be affected by the carotid hold. And in that study, the earlobe oxygenation never dropped below 90%. And it's hard to know how to interpret that.
There's one big speculation to whether or not it's a probable circumstance.
Response.
Your Honor, this is a study that Dr. Arnall cited in the report we provided in terms of measuring hypoxia in the brain. So it's a study upon which he relied that I think is instructive.
All right, the court will overrule the objection.
But what I was going to say is there's no way to actually stick a device into one of the cerebral arteries and measure it directly. So they tried to infer what it might have been, but it's too dangerous to stick a probe right up into a brain artery.
Dr. Arnall, when you reference these studies, either studies in medical experiments or medical literature referring to judo, do all of these studies occur in what we would call a controlled environment?
Oh, yes, the studies are either done with physicians in attendance, like the blood pressure cuff study, that there were physicians directly watching the subject second by second. In some of the studies, it's merely a review by physicians on what has happened in, for instance, competition. Now, those competitions would have referees, and the referees introduce an element of control over the circumstance.
The court will find that the witness is just trying to explain certain variables and based upon the judo studies. So the objection's overruled.
Well, that's my point. I don't know how good they are. And that answers the question, what was the level of control? The answer is some, I don't know.
Dr. Arnall, would you agree that certainly in the real world, not in a controlled environment, that there are risks associated with using a carotid hold?
Yes.
And are those risk factors something that you evaluated in this case?
Yes.
So did you look at the period following where you believe the carotid hold would have occurred?
Yes.
What, if anything, medically significant did you notice about the time frame immediately following where you believe the carotid hold occurred?
Elijah McClain is moving and talking. And that's part of the assessment of a person's neurological status. He's moving and he's talking. He's processing issues, both higher brain. He's moving, he's breathing.
Dr. Arnall, if and when a carotid hold is used, how does a person recover from it?
Once that's released, it takes 20 seconds to 60 seconds for recovery. recovery over some 20 to 60 seconds. One regains all their functions. And in this case, Elijah McClain obviously did.
If a person, well, when a carotid hold is used, am I correct that the cutoff of oxygen to the brain means hypoxic? The brain is in some state of being hypoxic. Is that correct?
The brain is, yes.
And is that a risk of death?
That is a risk, yes, of course.
And how does that risk of death from the brain being hypoxic factor into your analysis here?
Well, that's why I've specified the research that's been done. The risk is how long it's held. It's held up to 100 seconds. What research has been done indicates no one has died, no one has permanent injuries up to 100 seconds. If it's held 3 to 6 minutes, 3 to 5 minutes, yeah, 3 to 5 minutes, people can die. That's the risk. Depends on how long you hold it.
And so how do we know if it's held for any measure of time, how do we know that that hypoxic nature of the brain, how do we know how high that risk is?
The degree of risk is related to the time that the pressure on the neck is maintained.
Can a person suffer some hypoxia to the brain and not be at risk of death? Is it just all or nothing? You're saying length of time, so I'm trying to understand that.
The relative risk is related to the time. A short period of hypoxia to the brain causes no risk of death. Do you want me to give you an example?
Okay.
When a person has atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries in the carotid artery, the surgeons actually take little rubber bands and they have to occlude the blood flow to go inside the carotid artery to take the plaque out. So obviously, time it takes to get that plaque out, there are little rubber bands around the carotid artery cutting off the blood flow to the brain. Obviously, they do that surgery with a reasonable expectation that complete neurological recovery will occur. So it depends on how long. Obviously, the risk is related to that time period. But surgeons routinely do carotid endarterectomies without any permanent damage to the brain, and certainly without death. And the studies reiterate that fact. If it's held for a short period of time, there is no risk of death. And the whole point of going over the issue of carotid holds in judo is that in the last 140 years, when they've been doing this carotid hold, no one's died.
And Dr. Arnall, in terms of the length of time that someone may be subject to a carotid hold, what all do you look for, or how do you explain whether someone recovers from it?
A neurological assessment. We train in medical school how to assess a person's neurological condition. There's actually a scale called the Glasgow scale where we give a number to a person's neurological condition. Points are awarded for movement, points are awarded for communication. In this case, there's movement, there's communication. There's no evidence that there was any damage to the brain. And obviously he didn't die because he's talking afterward.
Well, are there factors that can hinder a person's ability to recover from a carotid hold?
Oh, yes, I think I specified that all this pertains to young individuals like Elijah McClain. In a person who is elderly, who has hardening of the arteries, yeah, permanent damage is more easily done if you have hardening of the arteries or any underlying medical illnesses. That's why I specified, I believe, in a young person like Elijah McClain.
But what about here in terms of recovering from a carotid hold? Could a continued struggle impact that?
The effects of the carotid hold resolve in 20 seconds to 60 seconds. There was a time period where this person was in the recovery position that far exceeded any necessary recovery time period.
Well, what about if a person begins vomiting? Does that affect recovery from a carotid hold?
If vomiting and aspiration occurs, now that's an independent problem. The carotid hold itself has full recovery after 20 to 60 seconds. If there is another problem, like aspiration of food that blocks the airway, that would be an independent problem. Yes.
Were you able to identify in this case, following the application of the carotid hold, whether Mr. McClain was in a recovery position at that time?
Yes, he was.
And was there anything in this case that suggests to you in the 30 to 60 seconds or even a couple of minutes following the carotid hold that Mr. McClain was not able or had not recovered from the carotid hold?
Nothing.
Response.
No, this is actually his opinion. Whether he can offer an opinion as to that.
All right. The court will allow the witness to answer the question as he already has. Go to weight versus admissibility.
Could you repeat that, doctor?
Please repeat.
Is there anything in this case that suggests to you in the 30 seconds to 60 seconds or even up to 2 minutes following the carotid hold that Mr. McClain was not able or did not recover from the carotid hold?
No, nothing at all.
Did you have opportunity to review the sort of ongoing restraints of Mr. McClain with any particularity?
Yes.
In the 15 minutes or so of body camera footage that follows the carotid hold, did you notice Mr. McClain's demeanor and presentation change?
Response.
I could just have a moment, Your Honor. This all goes to his ultimate opinion relating to the timeframe in the administration of ketamine, which is in his opinion, as well as his opinion related to hypoxia and acidosis, which is also noted in his opinion. So I think it has been disclosed.
All right. Well, that takes, I suppose, some collateral thinking. I'll allow you to rephrase.
Thank you, Your Honor. Following in the minutes following the carotid hold to 15 minutes later, did you notice a change in, I'll just ask you, did Mr. McClain's presentation change?
Response.
This is just foundational at this point. I'm not asking him for any specific diagnosis. I'm just asking if he was able to observe that in the video.
All right. I suppose you can answer it yes or no.
Yes.
Because we asked you very specifically to focus on the carotid hold, in your opinion, is that change connected to the carotid hold?
Judge.
Response.
Your Honor, his opinion is that the carotid hold did not contribute to death. And so that is specifically disclosed in his opinion. And I'm trying to lay the foundation for that ultimate opinion, which has been disclosed. It's on page 5.
Well, he's already testified that in that time period following the what he determined to be the period of time the carotid hold was used, in the minutes thereafter, that he had completely recovered. So the objection is sustained.
Did you ultimately, I apologize if I ask this. whether overall, did you reach a professional opinion as to whether the actions of Officer Woodyard applying a carotid hold in any way? I asked you about whether it caused the death. I'm now referring to your report about whether it contributed to the death.
Pardon me? Sustain.
And Your Honor, I'm not sure I understand, because that's ultimately who we are defending here, is whether we can connect actions of the carotid hold. I can rephrase it that way. Would that be appropriate?
No, I don't think so. We're asking the doctor to reach legal conclusions, so I'm sustaining the objection.
In terms of factors that contributed to death in this case as a pathologist, is that something that you reviewed related to this carotid hold?
The physiology? Yes, of course.
And just to make sure I didn't confuse everybody here, I'd asked you earlier whether you believe that the carotid hold caused death.
Physiologically? No.
You had noted the possibilities of acidosis in the case, Dr. Arnall. I want to ask you just a couple questions about that as referenced in your opinion. Would you, when we talk about acidosis, is that sort of a spectrum of a medical phenomenon? It can range from slight to severe. Do I understand that correctly?
In my lab, I have a machine. It measures the acid in the blood. Normal person, actually specific numbers, 7.35, 7.45. That's a normal range. All normal people are someplace in that range. Now, I'm producing acid all the time. I have to. When we produce energy through the Krebs cycle, we produce acid. But it's okay, because I exhale carbon dioxide, gets rid of the acid. We're all producing acid even as we sit here. Our bodies maintain our blood pH between 7.35 and 7.45. While we're all producing acid, I don't call that acidosis. I believe it's common usage of the term acidosis is when we have an abnormal reading in that measurement, something below 7.35. That's what I would call acidosis.
Do you agree that because there was a struggle in this case, there would be some level of acidosis in the body?
Well, I produce a certain level of acid right now doing nothing. As I start to exercise, I produce more acid and I breathe more often, blowing off the carbon dioxide and getting rid of the acid. So, depending on how much you exercise, you may drop your pH from a 7.45 to a 7.44 or a 7.43, maybe even a 7.40. But if you're asking me, can I look at a struggle and determine that that blood pH has dropped below a 7.35? I have no chance of doing that.
Does acidosis vary person to person based upon their metabolism?
How detailed an answer do you want?
Let me ask a better question. Does how we respond to physical exertion in terms of the buildup of lactic acid, does that vary person to person?
Yes.
Is there any way to measure that in this case?
In this case,
Yes, sir.
no.
I wanted to ask you just a couple more questions about hypoxia, because I was asking you about how the brain is affected when a carotid hold is used. How is the rest of the body affected when a carotid hold is used in terms of hypoxia?
In terms of hypoxia,
Yes.
person continues to breathe. The blood goes to the rest of the body with lots of oxygen. The rest of the body is not affected by hypoxemia related to a carotid hold. None whatsoever. whatsoever.
And so do I understand correctly that that means that the oxygen levels in the body do not drop when a carotid hold is applied?
That is correct.
See here. Is it possible, Dr. Arnall, from your review, I'd asked you about consciousness, but is it possible to know how long a carotid hold was in place?
I have tried to make that determination. I cannot.
When we are asking you these kinds of questions, you are familiar with, we're asking you to offer an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty. Is that the standard that you were held to?
Yes,
Can you tell us what that means?
I'm a pathologist. I look at numbers, I look at biopsies. Surgeon comes to my office, says, Dr. Arnall, you made the diagnosis of cancer in this patient, lung cancer. Are you certain? Because if you're certain, I'm going to cut the lung out. If I say I'm certain, the surgeon cuts out that lung on my word and my word alone.
Sustain.
To a reasonable degree of medical certainty, are you able to identify from everything that you have reviewed? I've asked you about body camera, but from everything that you have reviewed, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, can you determine levels of acidosis in this case?
Before the hospital admission, no.
What about oxygen levels in the body?
Before the hospital admission, no.
Dr. Arnall, were you able to arrive at a conclusion about the cause of death in this case based upon everything that you reviewed?
Yes,
And what is that opinion?
ketamine toxicity.
And how did you arrive at that, or can you explain that conclusion to the jury?
Yes. I looked at the results of the blood measurement of ketamine. So I know there's ketamine in the blood. I know when that ketamine was administered to the minute. It's both recorded in the medical record as well as visible on the body cams. I know from the literature the time frame that it takes for ketamine to reach its maximum concentration in the blood. And the time period
Response.
No, this is a legitimate opinion under 702 and 703. It is the exact foundation that has been laid for each of the prosecution witnesses based upon the exact evidence with the same or more credentials. It's in a proper opinion as to the cause of death.
All right, the court will overrule the objection.
so that the time frame of the collapse of Elijah McClain is the same as the time frame of the maximum concentration of ketamine in the blood. So the temporal relationship between the
You're okay.
You break.
So the temporal relationship between the administration of ketamine and the cardiopulmonary arrest is a compelling temporal relationship. And we are trained in forensic pathology to assess causality frequently in terms of the temporal to time relationship. That's one of our basic principles.
And so do you agree with the amended autopsy report from Dr. Sina that the timing of the ketamine administration is compelling for that reason?
I agree with Dr. Sina.
How does, if at all, the application of a carotid hold affect the effects of ketamine?
None.
Why not?
The carotid hold reduces blood flow, and by that method, reduces the oxygen in the blood vessels of the brain. Ketamine suppresses ventilation, respiration. Remember the carotid hold. During the carotid hold, the person keeps breathing. With ketamine administration, the person stops breathing. So the carotid hold causes reduced blood flow. Ketamine makes the person actually stop breathing. The mechanism is completely different.
Is there anything that you were able to identify about the effects of the carotid hold that just from that application, Mr. McClain would have still been experiencing at the time of the administration of ketamine? In terms of the length of time that had passed?
No effect whatsoever.
If I could just have one moment, Your Honor.
Yes.
That's all I have for now. Thank you, Doctor.
Right, I'm thinking we might take a break. Right. All right, folks, it's 20 after based upon the clock on the wall. I'm going to take our morning recess at this time. Don't form or express any opinions or discuss the case. Do no independent research. Avoid any press coverage. I'd like to have you back in roughly 15 minutes. Right, the jurors have stepped out. We may be seated. You may step down if you wish. If you could be back in about 15 minutes. Just a few minutes. We're going down to bring the jurors up from downstairs.
But you agree with me that you don't list the body worn camera as materials reviewed in your report.
All right. Yes.
And of course, it's always appropriate to inform both sides, the defense and the prosecution, what you relied on so we can fully understand your opinion. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
And of course, it also would be important to review the body worn cameras because it gives you additional information outside of the autopsy reports.
Correct.
And would you agree that sometimes it's really important as a forensic pathologist, since you're more a generalist, to call an outside expert on things?
Can you repeat that question?
Sure. Well, would you agree that as a forensic pathologist, you're somewhat a generalist?
The forensic pathology board certification is highly specialized.
But you generally view all aspects of the body in death versus how things represent in a clinical in a setting. Wouldn't you agree?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Well, isn't it imperative sometimes to get another expert on board, someone who looks specifically at an issue that's presenting in the death investigation?
Sometimes that's helpful, yes.
And that could be helpful to you because it understands how the patient could present in a clinical setting.
I agree.
And it's been a long time since you saw somebody in a clinical setting, right?
Yes.
Probably what, med school?
No.
After med school a little bit, residency?
Indeed, I saw patients in residency.
Yeah, but it's been a long time
Yes.
because your patients don't talk to you, right?
Well, I think I told you I was a laboratory director as well as a forensic pathologist, so that I was consulting on live patients as we discussed making diagnoses on lung cancer and such. So in my career, I've done both, but since 2005, the only live patients I would have consulted on was when I testified for the prosecution in non-fatal cases.
And in that case, you would be a blind expert, right?
Blind.
Yeah, you're talking generalities versus specific clinical analysis of the patient or the victim in the case,
No, that's not true.
right? In this case, did you actually go and do look at some original material with Dr. Sina?
I did not.
So you didn't look at the slides?
Correct.
And of course, you didn't ask for any additional slides for any of the tissue in the stock jar, did you?
Correct.
Did you make any original observations in this case?
None.
Now, your report is 9 pages, is that right?
I don't recall the number. I'll take your word for it.
Sure. You don't have any additional reports, do you?
That is correct.
And you have never testified or given a sworn statement previous to today, is that right?
Correct.
And in the report, you spend about 5 or 6 pages talking about these judo maneuvers. Is that fair?
I don't recall the number of specific pages.
And it's in certain specific professional sports that they use several holds, and one of them is the carotid hold. Is that true?
Correct.
And these are professional sports like judo and mixed martial arts, right?
The simple answer is no.
Well, in the studies that you gave in your report, it all dealt with athletes, correct?
Correct.
And isn't judo and mixed martial arts, aren't those or don't they appear to be violent sports, dangerous sports?
Yes.
And is the point in a judo competition to perform this hold in order to score a point and win the match?
Or render the individual unconscious and win the match. Yes.
It's not a situation typically, according to the studies you gave, that it's 3 competitors on one, right?
Correct.
And these studies all talk about that the intention is to allow one of the competitors, if they're in a carotid hold, to tap out and not to go unconscious.
That is correct.
These trained athletes in these sports, they know that a carotid hold could be applied to them during the competition.
Correct.
So they're prepared for that possibility.
Correct.
And it's rare in these competitions that they actually ever do go unconscious.
Well, I don't know about that. I don't necessarily agree.
And if they do go unconscious, there's medical staff right there to make sure that they recover and give the athlete time to recover.
I think as we spoke, there's significant variability. Some of the contests may have medical personnel, some may not.
Well, medical personnel are always present. You disagree about whether or not they're good or bad, correct?
I am unable to confirm that.
Well, there's referees there because the referee wants to interfere and not have the carotid hold be applied much longer than it needs to in order to win the point, right?
Correct.
And if these safeguards are in place, then the technique appears to be safe per these studies.
Correct.
But injuries still occur,
Correct.
such as structural neck injuries
Correct.
and ischemic brain injuries.
Those are possibilities. Yes.
Or certainly the article which talked about the approach for considerations for the management of strangulation in the emergency department listed those two as possible injuries of a carotid hold in that study.
That is correct.
You also had an article by Haga, H-A-G-A. Do you remember that study?
Yes.
And that talked about the cerebral artery blood flow. Is
Yes.
that correct? And it also talked about a study, and the first thing it says in the abstract is that these holds are extremely dangerous techniques,
I agree.
and that the use of this hold requires a high level of technical mastery.
I agree.
And the study specifically focused on 4 athletes.
I don't recall the specific number. Please continue.
If you like it, I can give you the study. Would you prefer that?
Please.
You may.
Just to give you some guidance. This chart kind of sets out. Let me know, Doctor, when you're ready to go on.
Please continue.
Do you remember that this study required approval of the ethics committee?
While I don't recall reading that, I am quite sure that it did.
And these 4 male judo practitioners, the article talked about them being extremely healthy, and they practiced judo for almost every day for approximately 3 hours. Do you remember that part?
No, but I can see on this
And,
spreadsheet that they've had a long career in judo.
and in that spreadsheet, it actually talks about the fact that they've had judo for 9, 10, 11 years.
As many as 12, yes.
And of course, full informed consent was obtained by these in order to do this study.
As is customary in all scientific studies, yes.
And per the study, the subjects, these 4 young men, actually assumed a resting position on the floor, and then the chokehold was applied by a professional judo teacher. Do you remember that part of the study?
Yes, I recall that.
And the chokehold was actually applied until one of these young men made a sign as to tap out.
I recall.
And it was not, the chokehold was not continued until the young man lost consciousness.
I agree.
And the young men, they were really in shape. Their heart rate was stated as to be 43 as a resting heart rate. Do you remember that?
I see figure 10. Yes.
And if a person has a resting heart rate of 43, they're in pretty good cardiovascular shape. Wouldn't you agree with me?
Yes.
But even they, without even going unconscious, their heart rate increased to 50 beats.
I see that. Yes.
And their blood pressure was also affected, correct?
Yes.
It went from 120 over 60 to 137 over 62.
Yes.
And that was in the condition that they weren't even rendered unconscious.
I agree.
And the study stated that the return of oxygen levels to the resting level took some time for each of these young men.
I see the sentence. These figures indicate that oxygenation of the brain decreased abruptly when the chokehold was applied and reached its lowest level when the subject tapped out. When the chokehold was released, however, oxygenation gradually increased and plateaued at a level about half of that at rest. Oxygenation then tended to slowly return to its previous level.
But it wasn't instantaneous.
I agree.
And in the discussion section, the author states, these techniques can directly affect human life and death.
Yes, I agree.
And it goes on to say that even if there's a slight delay in the time from when an individual taps out until the chokehold is released, the individual could be brought close to death.
I agree.
On page 7 of 8, it says oxygenation in the brain appears to take a relatively long time to return to its resting level.
Oxygenation in the brain appears to take a relatively long time to return to its resting level, although there are individual differences in the time needed to recover. Yes, I see that.
So it's not going to be 10 seconds for some people, 20 seconds for other people, or even 60 seconds. It depends on the person.
I agree.
When you have the cutoff of the blood flow due to this chokehold maneuver, you can have a loss of cerebral functions,
I agree.
such as memory and judgment.
I agree the person will go unconscious, so they'll have no judgment.
On page 7, the study continued in its discussion that said oxygenation does not readily return to its resting level in the recovery phase after a chokehold is released.
I agree.
It also says brain activity may take some time to recover.
I agree.
The study goes on to say that the brain is extremely sensitive to changes in oxygen dynamics.
I agree.
It goes on to say, even if brain functions are partly recovered after a hypnotic state, brain functions and intelligence do not return as quickly to their former state.
I agree.
One of the conclusions of this study was that even though chokeholds are permitted by the rules, that they maybe should not be permitted to be continued because of the physical effects relative to their benefit in judo competitions.
I see that, yes.
And finally, it talks about the frequency, that you're not supposed to apply a chokehold to the same individual and that that should be strictly prohibited.
I see that opinion, yes.
Your article noted that oxygen levels start to decrease. Isn't this cerebral hypoxia by definition?
Hypoxia is on a continuum. It is a relative term, but indeed, as the blood flow decreases, so does the oxygenation of the brain.
And of course, you would agree in this case, Elijah McClain was not a trained athlete.
I disagree with that.
He didn't consent to having the carotid hold used on him.
I agree with that.
He had 3 officers on him versus one-on-one competition.
I agree.
And there wasn't a referee involved or medical personnel on point when the carotid hold was applied.
Correct.
Would you agree with me that Elijah McClain was 23 years old and he was a normal 23-year-old walking before he met law enforcement?
Correct.
And would you agree that he was in a violent altercation with someone else?
Correct.
And that violent altercation was with law enforcement?
Correct.
And you would agree that he was placed in a carotid hold?
That is my understanding. Yes.
And is it also your understanding that one officer attempted the hold, but it's not clear about how much of the carotid hold was completed?
That is my understanding. Yes.
And then a second carotid hold was applied by an officer, and that caused Elijah McClain to become unconscious?
As I've said, I'm not going to be able to prove to you he was unconscious, but I am, and I say that after having reviewed, second by second, the conversation of the police officers and attempting to infer whether they perceived he was conscious or unconscious. And I couldn't arrive at a conclusion with certainty, but I agree it is possible.
Well, one of the officers at that moment in the video camera footage talked about that they heard Elijah McClain snoring.
Yes, I recall. Well, they said they heard snoring. They didn't say anything about Elijah McClain. I've contemplated that issue. As you pointed out, there's 4 people involved in a struggle. Someone heard what they thought was snoring. Whether it was snoring or snorting, I don't know. Was it another one of the police officers? I don't know. But I am aware that one of the police officers said that he thought he heard Elijah McClain snoring.
And because at that point, all the body worn cameras have basically dropped off, we don't know Elijah McClain's position right after the carotid hold.
I don't think they all fell off, but I agree with your final question. We don't know his position.
Well, one is in the grass,
I agree.
one goes dark, and one is broken, correct?
Well, again, I don't know that they fell off.
But we don't see exactly the position Elijah McClain is in right after the carotid hold.
Right, and that's what I said. I agree with your final question. I don't know his position.
What we do know is that he vomited into the mask he was wearing right after the carotid hold.
Yes,
And did you see those photographs of the vomit in the mask?
no,
You didn't ask for those?
correct.
Now, you would agree that there are different ways to become hypoxic?
Yes,
Lack of access to oxygen through respiration and through breathing, that can cause you to become hypoxic.
correct.
And the lack of blood flow, because blood flow brings oxygen to tissues, that can have you become hypoxic.
Correct.
And both of these situations create a low oxygen in the body.
Correct.
And isn't the purpose of the carotid hold to induce hypoxia in the brain? And so that causes the person to go unconscious?
Correct.
If someone says, I can't breathe, from a medical perspective, is that an emergency or could it be an emergency?
It sure could be.
Would you agree that low oxygen or hypoxia can cause acidosis?
Yes.
When a person overly exerts themselves, can they create too much acid in the body?
Yes.
And there is a couple ways to get rid of too much acid in the body. Isn't that true?
Correct.
One is to breathe it off.
Correct.
You need that carbon dioxide being released and oxygen coming in as a way of dealing with acidosis in the body.
Correct.
You can also get rid of it by urination and defecation.
Correct.
Were you aware that Elijah McClain defecated?
Objection, I think that's fact, not in evidence.
It is, Judge. There's a
Yeah.
picture.
Well, there was some testimony about it, so the objection's overruled.
Did you know that, Dr. Arnell?
I recall the period where he was either urinating or passing a bowel movement in the video because the police officers specifically stated that he had to, and they didn't say relieve himself, but that's what I inferred from the events. So I don't know whether it was urination or defecation, but I do recall the specific period where the officers alluded to the fact that he was relieving himself.
And did you also see pictures of his clothes that showed that?
No.
You could also get rid of acidosis by vomiting, correct?
Yes.
One of the biggest bag of acids we have is our stomach.
Correct.
And it's clear that Elijah McClain vomited several times.
Correct.
If a person is unable to get rid of that acid, if it remains too high, would you agree with me that that's a dangerous situation?
Correct.
Would you agree that aspiration can be a life-threatening event?
Correct.
And that aspiration in and of itself can set up in a vicious cycle?
Vicious cycle of what?
Well, things can really go downhill if you aspirate and you can't clear up that aspiration from your lungs.
Right. I've already agreed that they can die.
And certainly aspiration can limit a person's ability to get oxygen.
And that would be why they would die. Yes.
If a person is experiencing low oxygen or is hypoxic, they can become sleepy, right?
Correct.
And a person typically, if they are hypoxic, will put themselves in a state of sleep because that preserves organs. Is that right?
I'm not sure I agree with that specific statement.
When a person is sleepy or somnolent, they're not as responsive. Is that true?
I agree.
Are you aware from your review of the record whether or not Elijah McClain stopped talking for minutes and some seconds? I think it's 4 minutes and 51 seconds before he received the ketamine injection.
I recall seeing that and hearing that on the cams. Yes.
Would you agree that a person's position can contribute to them or contribute to their hypoxia?
I agree.
So if a person is sitting up, they will have a much better chance or opportunity to breathe and become less hypoxic.
I have to disagree with that.
But if they're in the prone position or the semi-prone position, they're going to have a harder time opening up their chest and to breathe deeply in order to release and get a better carbon dioxide oxygen exchange.
That is not correct.
If someone is on the prone position, belly on the ground, that one might make it tough for them to breathe.
It might.
That might contribute to either further hypoxia.
That is possible.
In your report on page 9, you state there's an absence of evidence that Elijah McClain experienced metabolic acidosis, hypoxia, or lactic acidosis. Based upon my review to date, I can find no diagnostic criteria or testing to rely upon to support such a diagnosis. Did I read that correctly?
You did.
And it's your professional opinion that there's no evidence at all of acidosis? Because that's how your report reads. So I just want to make sure I understand. No evidence at all.
Read the sentence again
I'm sorry, which sentence, sir?
in my report.
There is an absence of evidence that Elijah McClain experienced metabolic acidosis, hypoxia, or lactic acidosis.
That is correct.
So the absence of evidence means no evidence at all. Is that fair?
Correct.
But you've mentioned on direct, and I'll bring it up now, you're aware in the hospital records that the hospital tested Elijah McClain's blood and they found that there was lactic acidosis.
Yes.
So your statement that there's an absence of evidence is incorrect.
You are incorrect.
So just so that I'm clear, you're agreeing that in the medical records, there's clearly evidence of lactic acidosis.
Yes, definitive evidence.
Now, if someone was presenting with significant acidosis, would you expect the following symptoms? Needing to breathe really deep to clear it.
Correct.
Would you also expect shortness of breath, such as panting or complaints of breathing?
Your first question was correct. If they have acidosis, they will respond by vigorous respiration.
And of course, acidosis can cause hypoxia, correct?
Acidosis cause hypoxia. I don't think that's the way the body works.
Have you ever watched the show Ted Lasso?
Not that I know of.
Well, in the show, they're soccer players, football in England.
Objection, Your Honor. This is testimonial.
I'm just asking a hypothetical, Judge. I'll get to my point, I promise.
Right, why don't you ask a hypothetical rather than a television show?
If athletes are running up and down the field
Yes,
and they're breathing really heavily,
yes,
one of the body's reaction is to vomit because they can't get enough oxygen and they're building acid up because of their physical exertion.
that's a possibility. Doesn't always happen, but yeah, it's a possibility.
And then after that exertion, they can become sleepy. Tired.
Well, we're all tired after vigorous exercise, yes.
If I understood you correctly on direct examination, you are not offering an opinion on to things that contributed after the carotid hold that affected Elijah McClain to die.
While I have done a detailed review of all of the events, even through the hospitalization, I have not issued an opinion on any of those observations in court today.
You have focused your opinion today that the carotid hold alone did not cause death.
I agree.
You have talked about clinical signs of impairment that can be observed. Scratch that, bad question, Judge. Just give me one moment. You describe in your report psychological impairments. Is that fair?
I don't recall specifically what I said, but individuals can have psychological impairments, yes.
And in this case, in looking at Elijah McClain's physiological condition, there are signs that he had trouble breathing, correct?
He said he did, yes.
And there are also signs that he was non-responsive to questions, correct?
I agree that he was unresponsive to numerous questions.
And there's also signs that he lacked a response to painful stimuli.
I recall it, he said, ouch, on multiple occasions, but I am not sure I could show you the time where I was aware that someone was intentionally trying to cause pain, and he didn't say ouch, but I do remember that he said either oh or ouch on multiple occasions. I'm not sure I understand your question.
Well, that is something clinically that if someone did not respond to something that would typically cause them pain, that might be an indicator that something else is going on with them medically.
I agree.
And if someone is vomiting, that would be also something from a medical standpoint that could be a sign of something going on that is serious.
I agree.
And certainly you don't need a test to determine that a medical condition or a medical distress is occurring if someone is vomiting.
Those tests would assist me in determining why the person was vomiting. So when a person presents,
I'm sorry, Dr. Arnell, that wasn't my question. My question is you don't need a test to determine if someone is vomiting and a medical condition could be occurring.
well, you asked two questions. The first is, I don't need a test to see if someone's vomiting. Obviously, that's correct. As to whether a medical condition is occurring, that's the second question you ask. And I would want tests to determine if a medical condition was occurring.
So when a mom is a 3-year-old at home and that 3-year-old is vomiting, she doesn't know that a medical condition is occurring.
She knows that the child is vomiting.
If a person's responsiveness to questions deteriorates over a significant period of time, that could be a medical emergency, couldn't it?
I agree.
And you don't need a test to observe whether or not a person's coherency is deteriorating if you're watching them, do you?
I agree.
You talked on direct examination about the fact that in the autopsy, Elijah McClain did not have any structures of his neck that were injured.
Yes.
And of course, that would be consistent with the studies in the judo, correct?
Well, they usually don't do autopsies on the competitors. So what are you asking?
No, I'm sorry. You mentioned that Elijah McClain did not have any physical injuries.
Other than the petechiae, which were a clue. But when they did the internal examination of the neck, there were no bruises on the musculature or fractures of the thyroid cornua or fractures of the hyoid bone or bruises in the esophagus or vocal cords. That's what I said.
Thank you. But that would be consistent also with the studies that you presented in your report from the judo competition, that there is rarely any physical injury to the structures of the neck because the corduroid hold is applied appropriately. I mean, that's not the part of the arm that's going to be, it's supposed to not break those physical structures of the neck.
I agree. Please continue.
So the fact that there were no broken bones or broken structures of the neck in the autopsy is not really significant in this case.
Well, the presence of broken cartilage or broken hyoid bone would always be significant. I'm not sure I understand what you're saying.
Well, typically, don't you see those in strangulation cases?
Frequently, yes.
This is not a strangulation case.
I agree.
Thank you, Dr. Arnell. I have no further questions.
Redirect.
Dr. Arnall, Ms. Joyce had read to you a statement out of your report I wanted to understand as well. Do you recall when she asked you how you had written on page 9, therefore, there is an absence of evidence that Elijah McClain experienced metabolic acidosis, hypoxia, and lactic acidosis. Based upon my review to date, I can find no diagnostic criteria or testing to rely upon to support such a diagnosis. Do you remember her asking you about that paragraph?
Yes.
Okay. So a couple questions. Are you saying that there's no possibility that those things occurred?
Oh, there's a distinct possibility that they may have occurred. I just can't prove it to you.
So what do you mean when you say there's an absence of evidence?
There's no diagnostic testing which allows me to know what the level of oxygenation is or what the level of acidosis is. I can't prove it to you.
When you watch the body camera, can you identify times where these things may be possible?
Yes.
And so why is the video, I suppose, not diagnostic or not sufficient for you to say that's evidence?
Because of the ambiguity and my knowledge of the medical literature. Do you want me to be more explicit?
Well, I just wanted to understand when you say there's an absence of evidence, you are saying there's no way to determine these things occurred.
There are findings which are suggestive. That's why there's a possibility. But I cannot present to you evidence to prove it.
So when Dr. Sina writes, no, are you aware that Dr. Sina notes in his report the forcible restraint used upon Mr. McClain when he issued his manner of death? Are you aware that he noted that?
Response.
Well, this is going to explain specific questions that he was asked about the absence of evidence. So
All right, well,
it's within the scope.
at the moment, the court will find it's beyond the scope.
Let me ask a different way, Dr. Arnall. When you say that there's an absence of evidence of these things occurring, although you recognize that is certainly a possibility, do you agree in terms of your characterization of the absence of evidence that you cannot link these things to causing or contributing to death?
That is correct.
When you were asked about that paragraph, do you recall that that paragraph followed a discussion in your report noting, and I'm paraphrasing, that Mr. McClain was known to be a distance runner? Your Honor, this is actually rule of completeness because he was asked about this paragraph that is qualified by the preceding paragraph. So it is within the scope of cross, and I'd like to clean it up and clarify what he meant by that paragraph that she elicited.
All paragraphs in the report are following each other. So that would mean that she could go into everything in the report on the range rec.
Your Honor, this paragraph starts with therefore. So I just want to say what it is in reference to.
All right, well, the court will sustain the question, the objection to the question asked. You can try to rephrase.
Okay. With respect to your opinion about the absence of evidence of these items, what factors did you take into account in evaluating how Mr. McClain would have potentially dealt with hypoxia or acidosis in terms of that endurance that you were asked about on cross-examination?
It's actually beyond scope.
He was asked about acidosis after a physical exertion. This is
Overall.
indirect.
Please restate the question.
Were there factors about Mr. McClain that you took into account in terms of evaluating how he would have experienced acidosis following physical exertion?
Well, as you know, there's a mathematical proof of the answer to that question, but unless you want all the equations, I will just tell you, yes, of course.
Well, what I'm asking is, does evidence about someone's physical shape or endurance factor in?
Oh,
Shall I answer?
yes.
Yes, of course.
So how did you take that into account in this case?
Okay.
Well,
The-
and I'm not asking for a mathematical equation, but I'm just asking, is there evidence of that Elijah McClain was a runner? Is that something that you considered in terms of the physical exertion?
There's
question?
excellent evidence. There's excellent medical evidence in the medical record that he was an experienced runner who had undergone significant physiologic changes related to his exercise regimen. Yes.
You were asked a number of questions about the studies that you referenced in your report. I wanted to ask you, Dr. Arnall, are these medical studies or why are they referenced in your report?
In assessing what is possible, one has to know what isn't possible and vice versa. In assessing whether a carotid hold may have cause death, it's very helpful to have 140 years of experience that far exceed my experience. And in light of these studies indicating that no one's ever died, that's important in my decision as to whether it's my opinion that this may have contributed to death. If it hasn't happened in the last 140 years, it's unlikely that it happened this time.
Overruled.
You were asked a question about repeated carotid holds. Are you aware of any evidence in this case of repeated carotid holds?
In answering the question on cross, I said I was aware of an attempted carotid hold. I also have told you that I did a detailed timeline. I haven't found a period of time which would allow for a person to go unconscious and then regain consciousness for that period of time we've talked about, other than the single time period where the one carotid hold may have been exercised. So I'm aware that there may have been an attempt at another, but I agreed that I don't know that it was successful, and I haven't seen a period of time where I could reasonably infer that it was.
Can you, and if there was any attempt, do you have any way to know whether any pressure was actually applied?
I have no idea.
Sustain.
You were asked questions on cross-examination about the fact that Mr. McClain vomited into the mask he was wearing. Do you remember that line of questioning?
I do.
And did we ask you to review this issue of aspiration and discuss it with us as well?
Yes.
In your review of the case, is there any way to time or identify when aspiration occurred?
Well, there's a,
Your Honor, she asked about aspiration, has opened the door to follow-up questions on this topic.
All right. The court will find that the questions had to do with the specific aspiration and whether or not the doctor reviewed the mask or the photograph. So the objection is sustained.
Let me ask you a specific question related to the question you were asked, which was, are you aware that Mr. McClain vomited into his mask? With respect to that specific question, can you give an opinion as to whether that would have in fact been an aspiration event? Your Honor, that is what was.
Overall.
Thank you.
there's nothing based on the microscopic examination at autopsy that allows me to determine when the aspiration occurred. That science doesn't exist. As for the video and audio and that specific time, it's my opinion that aspiration didn't occur at that time.
With respect to the questions you were asked about vomiting, is there any way to, in your opinion, to diagnose or know what caused vomiting in this case?
There's more than one possibility.
And so can you determine to a reasonable degree of medical certainty what the cause was for Mr. McClain to vomit?
No, I cannot.
You were asked a question about whether aspiration can be life-threatening. And did I hear you correctly that you agree that aspiration can be life-threatening?
I agree.
Coming back to the period of time that we have asked you to evaluate following that carotid hold, did it appear to you that aspiration was life-threatening at that time?
Sustain.
Well, let me ask you the question about when the prosecution inquired about Mr. McClain saying, "I can't breathe." Do you remember being asked that?
I do.
And do you recall hearing Mr. McClain saying, "I can't breathe," prior to being put in the recovery position? Do you recall that?
I don't recall the answer to that exact question, no.
Okay. Do you recall evaluating Mr. McClain's verbal interactions after the carotid hold?
Response.
Your Honor, this goes to the question of aspiration being life-threatening and the questions about "I can't breathe." So I'm redirecting on those very specific questions. This witness was asked in terms of when those occurred and the risk at the time.
All right, the court will sustain the objection to that specific question.
You recall hearing "I can't breathe" at some point on the video, correct?
Yes,
You have also testified that as it goes to this idea that you were asked, "Can that be an emergency?" Do you recall?
I recall.
Do you recall testifying that Mr. McClain was put in a recovery position? Let me ask it.
And it's leading to.
I'll rephrase. With respect to the question about hearing "I can't breathe," did those complaints continue after being put in a recovery position?
Sustained.
Well, with respect being, the prosecution asked you about whether Mr. McClain was saying, "I can't breathe." Was that the entire duration of this encounter? Your Honor, I'd like to be able to redirect on something the prosecution asked in some fashion, because now we have the impression that, I mean, this is the purpose of redirect, is to try to qualify this expert's opinion with respect to that inquiry.
I agree. Rephrase.
Thank you, Your Honor. So what was medically speaking, what is the significance of "I can't breathe" related to the ultimate cause of death? The question that they asked you about.
Sustained that question.
I just want to clarify, after the application of the carotid hold, is it your medical opinion that there was evidence that Mr. McClain could not breathe?
Response.
I'm trying to redirect the witness as to the significance of does the court want us to approach? I'm trying.
Sure.
All right, Dr. Arnold, I think I've got it. In terms of your medical opinion in this case, how did the statements, "I can't breathe," factor in?
As to whether there's diagnostic evidence of hypoxia or acidosis, the fact that he actually talked indicates that he has to be breathing, because you can't talk without passing air across your vocal cords and then articulating with your tongue. So if a person's telling you they can't breathe, that means they're breathing. So a person can breathe, they can repair their acidosis and repair any hypoxemia that may have occurred.
Finally, you were asked a question about whether Mr. McClain appeared normal when he was walking home before encountered by law enforcement. Do you remember that question?
I do.
And of course, do you agree that that is the case?
Physically? Sure.
For purposes of your review, were you in fact asked not to look at this as far as what everybody did, but to try to evaluate the actions of one officer? Is that a fair assessment of how your review was structured?
Response.
He was asked whether Mr. McClain was normal before encountered law enforcement. And so this goes to clarify the purpose of his review. Did not include.
Sustained.
You were also asked about a question about whether there were other things that happened after the carotid hold that were not part of your review. Do you remember the prosecution asking you that?
Yes.
But in fact, did you review what happened that led to death, in your opinion, in this case?
Yes, of course I did.
If I could just have one moment, Your Honor.
Yes.
You had said earlier, Dr. Arnall, that it is your opinion with respect to the question you were asked about Mr. McClain vomiting in the mask, that aspiration did not occur at that time. Can you explain why?
Sustained.
Or no, I didn't ask why. I just asked about the timing. And so just to flesh out that opinion, because he was asked about the vomit in the mask.
And he was asked about whether he believed there was an aspiration event already.
Okay. And this goes to the basis for that. That's sustained. Why he arrived at that?
He's already testified to that.
As to why there's not?
Why he reached his conclusion that there was not an aspiration event. Yes, he has.
Then just finally, Dr. Arnall, if you aspirate into a mask, can you cough?
All right. I think the terminology would be vomit into a mask rather
Thank
than
you.
aspirate into a mask.
Thank you. That's correct. Are there things that you looked for in terms of what you testified to earlier?
I'll allow this question.
Yes, I looked at anything that I'm aware of based on my medical education, which would have assisted in evaluating the answer to that question.
And can you tell us what that included?
Yes, I can. Anyone who aspirates is going to cough like crazy. I didn't hear that in the audio.
If I could just have one more moment. That's all I have. Thank you, Your Honor.
May the witness be excused. All right, you may step down. We have a witness we could fit in for 15 minutes.
Do if you'd like, Your Honor. We have a quick one.
All right, that's fine. We'll call your next witness. If you'll come up to my right.
Your Honor, the defense is calling Ryan Walker again.
It's almost where the testimony you're about to give the truth and nothing but the truth. Yes. All right, if you'll be seated, and I think we have a different court reporter perhaps, so if you could state your name and spell your last.
Ryan Walker, Walker.
Your witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Walker, good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome back. There are some questions we wanted to ask that we didn't cover last week. So just to kind of pick up where we left off, could you remind the jury where you are employed?
Currently,
Yes.
I'm a firefighter paramedic for Arvada Fire.
Okay. And did you previously work as a paramedic with Falck?
Yes,
And do you recall testifying about that role in this case, I think maybe week before last?
yes.
Okay. Okay, so just to kind of reorient you to ask a few follow-up questions, do you recall responding by ambulance to a call from Aurora Fire on August 24th, 2019?
Yes,
And do you recall that's sort of the discussion we had previous in the case?
yes.
And do you recall, and again, this is just kind of to reorient ourselves, being asked about what you observed when you arrived?
Yes,
Okay, and we have discussed your interactions with Aurora Fire, right?
yes.
Did you have any interactions or discussions with any police officers?
Not that I remember.
Okay. Just to review your background briefly, Mr. Walker, when did you become a paramedic?
In May of 2019,
Okay, and what does the training to become a paramedic include?
you first have to have your EMT basic license, and then it's roughly about a year of school, depending on the program that you go through.
Okay, how long does it take to get the EMT basic license?
I believe around 6 to 8 months.
Okay, and then where did you go to school for that 1 year?
St. Anthony's paramedic program.
And can you just give a very general overview of what kinds of things you get trained to be a paramedic?
Yeah, we go through pharmacology, cardiology, different kind of illnesses and the pathophysiology of them and how to treat them.
Do you learn how to administer medications?
Yes,
Do you learn about different kinds of medications?
yes,
Do you receive any specialized training on how to administer injectable medications?
yes.
Do you learn about aesthetic medications like ketamine?
I know that we went over ketamine in paramedic school. Yes,
Okay, was there specialized training specific to ketamine?
I don't recall any like specialized training, but
Okay. As part of becoming a paramedic, do you learn how to check for breathing and sort of monitor breathing?
yes,
And do you train on how to monitor oxygen levels?
just we have the monitor on the ambulance that monitors the oxygen levels. Yes,
Well, I'm glad you said that because I was going to ask, is there equipment that does that you use?
yes,
And is that called pulse oximetry?
it is.
Okay, what is that exactly?
It's a little probe that goes encapsulates the finger, and through different light waves, it detects the pulse and the oxygen level in the blood.
When you went to work for Falck, did you receive training specific through that company as well?
The company from the monitor?
Just from Falk in terms of additional training to be a paramedic.
I'm not sure what you're asking.
Well, to be more specific, did you receive specific training on ketamine from Falk?
Yes.
Sorry? All right, well,
That was,
all right, I'll allow the witness to answer.
you want me to repeat that?
Yes, please.
As part of training or working with Falk, did you receive any training specific to ketamine?
Not that I specifically remember.
Do you remember like a PowerPoint presentation or slides on ketamine for Falk paramedics?
I've been shown them in preparation. I'm not sure if I recall the PowerPoint from previous testimonies or from the actual presentation.
Okay. Is there a presentation that Falk does for paramedics specific to ketamine?
Yes.
Okay. And as part of your training, either generally or with Falk, is there an assessment that must be completed before giving someone ketamine?
Yes.
What does that assessment require?
Just
Response?
I'm actually not asking for expert opinion at this moment. I'm just asking about what his training is, which is not specialized knowledge. I'm trying to lay the foundation for expert opinion potentially.
All right, if he can specifically remember the training, I'll allow him to answer.
Do you recall, Mr. Walker, what the assessment requires in terms of how you were trained prior to giving someone ketamine?
specifically on the training that I was getting, I don't recall.
Can you explain to us just generally what your knowledge is about how to assess someone before administering ketamine?
Sustain.
After undergoing the training to become a paramedic and then working with Falk, did you work in a role of ever dealing with ketamine?
I had not administered ketamine
Okay.
previously.
Are you aware of how ketamine should be administered or how to calculate dosing?
Sustain.
I guess, Mr. Walker, as a paramedic, do you generally treat people in the field?
Yes.
And you talked about being trained on injectable medications, correct?
Correct.
But maybe I'm misunderstanding. You are not trained on administering ketamine?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
Well, are you or are you not trained to administer ketamine?
Yes, I am.
You are, okay. So with that, Your Honor, so that I can ask questions about it, I would move to qualify Mr. Walker consistent with his endorsement as an expert to discuss the administration of ketamine, which he has specialized training on.
Training that he says he does not remember. Basis for an expert opinion, and that has never endorsed this witness as an expert.
Sustain.
Your Honor, may I respond to the objection?
You may.
He's endorsed as an expert by the prosecution, and he did not, we endorsed him in the same fashion. So we're relying on what has been disclosed or what they've provided.
Sustain.
Well, okay, did I misremember? Was your ambulance called to bring ketamine to this scene?
It was called to the scene. Yes.
Okay, and I'm just trying to back up so that I remember where we left off. Do I remember correctly that you filled the syringe to provide to Aurora Fire?
Yes.
Okay, so did you know how to do that or what amount to use?
When talking with paramedic Cooper and the dose that he asked for, yes.
Okay. And then in terms of your training, there is an assessment that is done prior to administration of ketamine. Can you tell me if you did that in this? I can reframe the question, Your Honor.
You may rephrase.
What,
We need to specifically deal with his training prior to this incident, not afterwards.
sure. So just in terms of what you did you observe any, not asking what should be done or what is trained to be done, but did you observe any assessment of Mr. McClain, anybody doing anything?
Not that I observed, no.
And of course, you're talking with Aurora Fire, but did you complete any kind of observation or assessment of Mr. McClain?
Not prior to the administration, no.
Without dealing with ketamine specifically, when you are just dealing with injectable medications, are there other injectable medications that you are more familiar with?
Yes, there are.
And when you are assessing someone in the field, do you ever,
Response.
this is getting to other visual assessments that can be done relative to ketamine or any injectable medication?
Well, the scope of injectable medications is very broad. So I'll sustain the objection.
For purposes of a treatment, do you ever assess a patient's weight?
Yes.
How do you do that?
So for every report that we write, we have to put in the patient's weight. And so usually when I have a patient that can talk with me, I'll estimate their weight, then ask them what it is, see if I'm close. And that's kind of a rule of practice that I do for myself, since we have to put it in every time to kind of train myself to be able to better estimate people's weight when they can't answer the question.
And so in terms of someone who can't respond, do you still try to estimate their weight for purposes of any treatment you might be doing?
Yes.
And were you able to do that in this case, just based on a visual?
Not prior to the administration.
Right, but after, were you?
Yes.
And how close in time?
Once we got him onto the gurney.
And what did you estimate his weight to be? And Your Honor, this is actually,
Response.
thank you. This is actually not specialized knowledge. This is my opinion based upon a visual estimate, and it goes to the relevance of the dosing in this case.
All right. Well, based upon the foundation, court could find that it's not expert testimony, but somewhat educated guess. So I'll allow it.
And so, Mr. Walker, just after the administration of ketamine, were you able to make that visual estimation?
Yes.
Do you remember what you estimated the weight to be?
I believe in my report, I put 160 pounds.
Do you know, without getting into how dosing is calculated? Well, let me ask you, do you know how to calculate proper dosing of ketamine? This is seeking to lay the foundation, Your Honor, in terms of whether it's something he has experience with.
Prior to August of 2019,
Yes,
if you ask him that question, I will consider it.
thank you. Mr. Walker, on or prior to August 24th of 2019, did you have any knowledge or training about how ketamine should be measured in terms of dosage?
Yes.
Okay. Do you remember that training and that, how that's done?
I remember it 5 milligrams per kilogram.
And so at the time of August 24th, 2019, after assessing Mr. McClain's weight, based upon your understanding of ketamine, did you have concerns about that dose?
Sustain.
Well, Your Honor, based upon the knowledge of dosing and the training that's now been established as of August 24th, 2019,
The court sustained the objection.
I'm simply asking if I can tender him as an expert with respect to these measurements at this time, now that we've established it.
Woodyard.
So, Mr. Walker, you testified a moment ago that you don't remember the training you received back in 2019 regarding ketamine. Is that correct?
Correct.
You're not aware of any of the scientific studies that would have gone into calculating what the proper dosage for weight is?
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Sure. Whoever decided what the proper dosage is, which you mentioned, 5 milligrams per kilogram.
Correct.
You don't know what scientific studies or medical studies they relied upon to create that, do you?
No.
So outside of knowing that number, 5 milligrams per kilogram, do you have any deeper knowledge about why that is what it is?
No.
Were you asked in the course of your job ever to determine, never mind, I don't need to ask that. That's all the questions I have for you.
All right. Your record. Response.
Your Honor, I would ask to tender him as an expert. He cited the proper calculations and he's.
Well, in your opinion, the proper calculations. No, the court finds that A, he can't remember what the training on ketamine was in 2019, and B, he's doesn't have any specific knowledge of why the dosages are as he understands them to be.
Mr. Walker, understanding, I asked you questions about whether you remember all of the training. Do you recall ever being trained by Falk not to use a standard 500 milligram dose? Do you remember that being part of the training specifically?
Not only from reviewing that PowerPoint
Okay.
recently.
Okay. And so in terms of basic math, I would ask that 160 pounds, we do 5 milligrams per kilogram is a 360 dose. Is that right?
Objection. Counsel's testifying and also the math are not kilograms.
Yes, is leading, and the jury can do the math.
Mr. Walker, with respect to providing the syringe of ketamine to Fire, did anyone with Fire confirm any of these assessment details or have a discussion with you about the medication?
Yes.
Okay, and did that discussion include any assessment of weight by the Aurora Fire that you can recall?
Not that I recall, just the dosage.
Who was making the medical decisions that you observed related to the patient?
Paramedic Cooper.
With respect to the administration of ketamine, was there any medical equipment present or utilized at the time of the injection?
Not at the time of the injection. No.
How quickly after you arrived was the ketamine given, if you can recall?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Were you relying on Aurora Fire to have completed whatever assessment you believe should have been completed?
Response.
I'm not asking him to speculate. I'm just asking in terms of his reliance and his understanding. Not whether something had or had not been done.
I'll sustain the objection. You can try to rephrase.
To your knowledge, did you ever see any assessment completed on Mr. Mitt?
It was.
After you arrived, just prior to the injection, did you see anyone attempt any interaction with Mr. McClain or assessment?
Not any assessment, no.
And were you in a position, Mr. Walker, with the paramedics that you could see Mr. McClain at the time of the injection?
I was not able to see him.
You could not see him?
Correct.
At the time, did you see him at some point after you had arrived while Mr. McClain was on the ground?
Not until he got to the gurney.
You didn't see him on the ground? I seem to remember you being asked questions about how he was being held.
Yeah, I was able to see his feet and I couldn't see the rest of his body.
Okay. Could you tell, based on the limited view you had of him, whether he was moving at all?
I could not tell.
Was there anything that presented to you about Mr. McClain having difficulty breathing when you were able to observe him?
Not that presented to me, no.
You just have one moment. Thank you for being there.
Cross-examination? Might make sense to keep going.
Now, Mr. Walker, one of the first things that you were asked about by the defense attorneys a moment ago was who was making the medical decisions that you observed? And you said Paramedic Cooper, is that correct?
Yes.
Who did you observe to be making the decisions about how Mr. McClain was being restrained on the ground?
Objection, speculation.
All allowed if the witness can answer.
You can answer. Who did you perceive to be making the decisions about how Mr. McClain was being restrained on the ground?
I'm not sure.
Well, you heard Mr. Redeema saying, hey, Woody, hey, Rosie, in a minute here, once this medicine,
It's testimony from the video camera repeatedly been disallowed.
Sustained, rephrase.
Your Honor, I'm impeaching the witness. He says he didn't know.
I know what you're doing.
Now, so Mr. Walker, one of the ways that we could describe who's making the decisions about he's being restrained is who's giving orders. Fair?
Yes.
You watched the videos with us last week, right?
Yes.
You remember one of the officers giving instructions to the other officers about how they were going to restrain Mr. McClain?
About how they were going to move him, yes.
Yeah. And that they were going to keep him on the ground until they moved him to the gurney?
Yes.
Okay. So it would be fair to say the officers were the ones making the decision about how they were going to restrain Mr. McClain.
Objection, speculation.
Overruled.
Yes.
Okay. So while the officers are making the decision about how to restrain Mr. McClain, did you witness any of the other officers trying to change anything about what was going on?
Not that I witnessed.
Did you see anybody running in and saying, hey, get him off the ground? Did
No.
you see anybody saying, hey, stop pinning him down prone there?
No.
So while Mr. McClain was pinned down there, everybody just sat around and did nothing?
As we were waiting for the medication to take effect.
So that was a yes? Everyone sat around and did nothing?
Yes.
All right, that's all I have for you, Mr. Walker. Thanks.
Redirect.
Replay. In light of those questions, Mr. Walker, do you know which officer was giving orders to others?
Speculation.
Yeah, I think we need a little foundation to figure out if he even knows who any of the officers are.
Do you know who any of the officers are?
Not by name, no.
In terms of which officer was giving those instructions, would you be able to say who that is?
No.
Asked a lot of questions about everybody standing around. Were there medical people there?
I'm sorry, what was it?
Were there medical people there?
There were EMTs and paramedics, yes.
And did the medical people, in terms of the Aurora fire, the people giving the injection, jump in and do anything?
Just administer the medication.
Thank you.
May the witness be excused.
Yes, thank you.
All right, you may step down. All right, we're going to take our lunch break. Now it's roughly 10 minutes after 12. Don't form or express any opinions or discuss the case with anybody. Do no independent research. Stay away from any press coverage. I'd like to have you back here in the courtroom by 1:30. So we'll give you about an hour and 20 minutes for lunch.